she came back in pieces, not dead. The Persians were far too precise for mercy. Alive, walking, breathing, her nose gone, her ears removed, her lips carved away, her tongue silenced so completely that even if she survived the days ahead, and we do not know if she did, she would never again speak the name of the man who ordered it done. She stumbled through the corridor of the palace, attended by servants who had witnessed the deed and would spend the rest of their lives pretending they had not, and she fell into the arms of her husband, Masistes, Persian prince, brother to the king of kings, a man who had ridden to war, governed provinces, served the empire with the particular loyalty that only family can give, looked at what had been returned to him and understood something so absolute, so final, that no words existed in any of the 40 languages spoken within the empire's borders to contain it. His wife, unmade, sent back to him not as a message of hatred, but as something colder and more devastating than hatred, as a demonstration of capability, as proof of what the empire could do when it chose to, and chose to smile while doing it. This was not passion, it was not jealousy in any ordinary human sense of the word. What happened in that palace chamber was the product of years of calculation, of watching and waiting and converting every humiliation into strategic information, of understanding that in an absolute monarchy, the most dangerous weapon available to a woman with no army and no legal recourse was patience, patience and the perfect moment. Queen Amestris had both. What we are about to walk through is 5 of the darkest truths about what absolute power looks like from the inside. Not the battlefield version, the clean, distant narrative of armies and victories and carved inscriptions on mountainsides. The interior version, the palace version, the version that happened in lamplit chambers and gilded corridors and walled garden compounds where queens made decisions and kings discovered too late that the systems they had built to control others had quietly, inexorably begun controlling them. This is the story of Xerxes, of Amestris, of a woman whose name history swallowed and whose suffering history almost did the same too, and of an empire so sophisticated in its cruelty that 25 centuries later, the mechanism of it still makes you catch your breath. To understand it fully, we have to go back to the beginning, not just to the palace, but to the man who built the world inside it, and the world he inherited when he took his throne. Xerxes I did not inherit a small kingdom, he inherited the world. By 486 BC, when he ascended to the Achaemenid throne following the death of his father Darius the Great, the Persian Empire stretched from the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west to the vast river plains of the Indus Valley in the east. North to south, it ran from the steppes above the Black Sea down to the first cataract of the Nile, a territory so enormous, so geographically and culturally diverse, that it contained within its borders somewhere approaching 40% of the entire human population alive on Earth at that moment. 30 nations paid tribute. Dozens of languages were spoken under the Persian banner. Satrapies, semi-autonomous provinces governed by appointed officials who answered ultimately to the crown, stretched across terrain that took months to cross on horseback. At the apex of all of it, surrounded by the carved stone reliefs of Persepolis, that extraordinary complex of palaces and ceremonial halls that Darius had begun and Xerxes would expand and beautify, sat the king, Shahanshah, king of kings, the living representative of Ahura Mazda's divine will on earth, the supreme authority over every person, every resource, every future within the empire's vast borders. It is tempting for those of us who know Xerxes primarily through the lens of Hollywood, through the golden-draped, towering figure of the film adaptations, through the stylized mythology that has grown up around the Battle of Thermopylae, to flatten him into a villain, a tyrant, an ego so vast it declared war on the sea, and the historical record does confirm a ruler of extraordinary grandiosity. When a storm destroyed the bridge of boats Xerxes had ordered built across the Hellespont to move his army into Greece, he famously ordered the sea itself to be whipped and branded, and had the engineers responsible for the bridge's failure executed. That story, whether entirely literal or somewhat embellished by Herodotus in the retelling, captures something true about the man. He did not accept limitation gracefully, but the fuller picture is more interesting than the caricature. Xerxes was also a man of considerable political intelligence, raised in the most sophisticated court in the ancient world, trained from childhood to understand that power was not merely military, power was symbolic, Power was architectural, power was psychological. The palaces of Persepolis were not simply beautiful, they were arguments. Every carved column, every processional staircase ascending toward the Apadana throne room, every relief of tributary nations bowing in an eternal procession before the Persian king, these were statements about the natural order of the world. The universe organized itself, in the Persian imperial worldview, with Persia at the center and the king at the apex of Persia. Everything else was subsidiary, everyone else was, ultimately, subject. This is the worldview in which Xerxes grew up. This is the lens through which he understood relationships, obligations, desire, and resistance. And this is what makes the story of his court so deeply unsettling, because a man who has been told his entire life that he is the representative of God on earth, that his authority is divinely ordained and cosmically correct, does not develop a healthy relationship with the word no. To understand how that plays out in practice, we need to spend some time inside the harem, because the harem is not a background detail in this story. It is the architecture of the story itself. Popular imagination has done the harem a spectacular disservice. When most people hear the word, they picture something from a fantasy: silk curtains catching the breeze from a central fountain, jeweled cushions on tiled floors, the smell of rosewater, women in elaborate dress, lounging in a kind of pampered, leisured paradise. A reward, a luxury. That image is not entirely false. The surfaces were real. The silk, the gold, the rich food, the servants, the beautiful clothing. A woman entering the Persian harem would have found material comfort that exceeded almost anything available anywhere else in the ancient world. But beneath those surfaces was something that had nothing to do with luxury. The harem was a processing machine, and its raw material was human beings. Every woman who entered was catalogued with bureaucratic precision. Not noted, not introduced, catalogued, her origin, her family, her lineage, her age, her status within her home culture, entered into administrative records that the harem's eunuch staff maintained with the same methodical care the empire applied to grain inventories and tax accounts. She was assigned a registration number, a chamber allocation, a position within the harem hierarchy. She was assessed, documented, and filed. The harem administration tracked her movements within the compound, monitored her interactions with other residents, controlled her communications with the outside world through layers of oversight that made correspondence with her own family a matter of official permission rather than personal right. She did not enter the harem, she was entered into the harem. The distinction matters. One is an action, the other is a transaction, and she was not the one conducting it. The eunuchs who staffed the harem, men castrated specifically so they could manage the women's quarters without the political complications that would arise from the presence of intact men, were not attendants in any domestic sense. They were the processing system made human. They reported upward through an administrative chain that ran directly to the palace authority. They managed access, recorded interactions, maintained the internal hierarchy of the compound. They were, in the most literal sense, the people who kept the records. Think about what that meant for the woman inside. Your name was in the system. Your lineage was documented. Your history, the kingdom your father ruled, the dynasty you were born into, the future you had imagined for yourself, all of it recorded. And yet none of that record gave you any power whatsoever. The documentation was not there to preserve your identity. It was there so the empire could track its inventory. Your name in the harem register was not evidence that you existed. It was evidence that you had been processed. This is what the Book of Esther is actually documenting when you read it through a historical rather than purely theological lens. The selection process Xerxes used, the systematic gathering of young women from across the empire, the year-long preparation, the single night with the king, the verdict was the processing system operating at full bureaucratic scale. It was not romantic, it was procurement. It was the harem doing exactly what it had been designed to do: receive human beings, catalogue them, and deliver the output the king required. Esther survived it through exceptional intelligence, courage, and the intervention of her cousin Mordecai. Most women did not have that story. Most women entered the record, lived inside the record, and died inside the record. The system consumed them. The system was designed to consume them. And the most chilling part is that consumption left no mark, no wreckage, no visible evidence of destruction. Just a name in a register, and then silence. But there was one woman who existed just outside the harem's walls, technically free, technically unregisterable by the mechanisms of imperial processing, protected by her marriage to a Persian prince. A woman who had already once told the King of Kings no, and that refusal, that single act of self-possession in a world designed to eliminate self-possession, was about to set the entire court on fire. There is a particular kind of danger that wears a crown and smiles. Amestris understood this better than anyone alive in the Persian court. She had watched her husband for years, watched him receive foreign queens like gifts, watched him walk through the harem corridors with that particular expression men wear when they believe no one important is watching. She had survived his reign not by being soft, not by weeping into silk cushions, but by being something far more useful than beautiful. She was patient, strategically, terrifyingly patient, and in the Persian court, where everything was performance and nothing was private, patience was the sharpest blade in the palace. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand what Amestris did and why it sent shockwaves through the entire empire, you first have to understand the obsession that started it. This story does not begin with revenge, it begins with desire, specifically, Xerxes' desire for a woman he absolutely could not have. Her name is never recorded in full by Herodotus. History swallowed it, the way history swallows most women who did not survive powerful men with good record keepers. We know her only as the wife of Masistes, Xerxes' own brother, a royal woman, nobly born, by all accounts striking enough that Xerxes, the King of Kings, the man who commanded armies of 100,000 soldiers, the man who had the Hellespont whipped for defying him, that man could not stop thinking about her. Let that settle for a moment. Not just the desire itself. Men in power have always desired what they should not, but the specific texture of this desire. Xerxes had a harem filled with the most carefully selected women from every corner of the known world. Daughters of defeated kings, daughters of allied nobles, women who had been chosen, prepared and processed specifically for his attention. And yet the woman he wanted was the one woman the entire architecture of Persian royal protocol made untouchable. His brother's wife, his own blood. He pursued her anyway. Herodotus tells us Xerxes made his intentions known directly. He wanted her. She refused him. Not through messengers, not through the careful diplomatic deflection that court life demanded, she simply refused. And this refusal, delivered face to face to the most powerful man in the world, represents a kind of courage so stark that it is easy to miss how extraordinary it was. In a court where everything and everyone ultimately belonged to the king, saying no to the king was not merely socially awkward. It was, in a very real sense, an act of defiance against the fundamental premise of the empire. She said no anyway. Xerxes, faced with rejection, did not abandon his obsession. He redirected it. If he couldn't have the mother, he would engineer a way to keep the family close. He arranged for his own son, the Prince Darius, to marry Artainta, the daughter of Masistes, the daughter of the very woman he desired. Consider the calculation embedded in that move. By binding his son to her daughter, Xerxes pulled Masistes' entire family into his own orbit. They were no longer merely relatives. They were now bound by marriage to the crown prince of Persia. Masistes' wife would have to attend royal functions. She would be present at banquets, at ceremonies, in the halls where Xerxes held court. He had engineered proximity through his own son's marriage. This is the detail that Hollywood versions of this story consistently miss. This was not passion. This was empire logic applied to desire. The same cold strategic calculation Xerxes used to plan military campaigns, now directed at a woman who had told him no. The intimacy of it makes it more disturbing, not less. He moved his son like a chess piece to keep himself close to a woman he wanted. And then something happened that Xerxes genuinely did not plan for. He fell for the daughter instead. Artainta, young, newly married to the crown prince, now living within the palace walls with her new husband and his court, became the new focus of Xerxes' obsession. Whether this shift happened gradually, through proximity and opportunity, or suddenly, in the way that these things sometimes happen even to kings, we cannot know. What Herodotus tells us is that the affair began. The King of Kings and his own son's wife, in the corridors of Persepolis, in the shadow of stone reliefs depicting 30 nations bearing tribute to the Persian throne, the most powerful man in the world was conducting an affair that would, with the slow inevitability of a fault line, destroy everything it touched. And then came the robe. This is the detail that elevates the whole catastrophe from scandal to tragedy, because the robe is the moment where every thread of the story was woven together, by people who had no idea what they were weaving. Amestris, queen of Persia, Xerxes' official wife, had spent considerable time making a robe for her husband. This was not a casual domestic gesture. In the Persian court, clothing was one of the primary languages of power and intimacy. A robe woven by the queen's own hands, her time, her skill, her deliberate creative effort, was a declaration of devotion, of status, of the bond between the king and his queen, made tangible, wearable, public. Amestris had made this for Xerxes, with her hands. As her statement, Xerxes received it. He wore it, presumably, at least once. And then, in a moment of infatuation so reckless that it reads, even at this distance, as almost inexplicable, he gave it to Artainta. The catastrophe announced itself from miles away. Artainta wore the robe, openly, in public, perhaps naively, not fully understanding the weight of the object she was displaying, perhaps defiantly, in the way that young women sometimes do when they are certain of their power over a man and not yet certain of its limits, perhaps with a kind of deliberate recklessness, a decision made in the knowledge that this could not end well, and the choice to wear the robe anyway. History did not record her interior state, only her action. She wore it, in public, where Amestris could see. Here is where the common interpretation of Amestris fails her. The instinct is to read her as a jealous wife, a woman acting from wounded pride and personal humiliation. That reading is too small for what she actually was. Amestris was a queen who had spent her entire reign learning to understand power, where it lived, how it moved, what it cost to maintain it, against the constant pressure of a court full of people with competing interests. She had watched Xerxes' obsessions before. She had absorbed insults and humiliations the way rocks absorb water, not helplessly, but strategically, converting each one into information about the system, about the king, about the exact location of every lever available to her. The robe was not just a personal betrayal. In the Persian court, where every gesture was a political statement and symbolism was the primary architecture of authority, it was a public declaration about whose power was real. Xerxes had given away something made by her hands, something that belonged symbolically and literally to their bond, to the woman he was sleeping with. He had announced in the language the court understood best that Amestris's position was decorative, that her intimacy with the king was transferable, that the queen's hands could make something beautiful and the king could give it to whomever he chose. Amestris began to plan. She waited for the Persian royal birthday celebration. And here is something the story rarely slows down long enough to let you feel properly. She did not wait because she had to. She waited because she chose to. Because somewhere in the architecture of her patience, she had identified the one mechanism in the entire Persian legal and ceremonial framework that would transform what she intended to do from an act of violence into an act of law. The royal birthday was not simply a party. It was a specific ceremonial institution, the one day per year when the king was formally, structurally, irreversibly bound by custom to grant whatever request his queen made. This institution had a function in the political theology of the monarchy. It existed to demonstrate that even the King of Kings operated within a framework of reciprocal obligation, that kingship was not pure extraction but an exchange, however asymmetrical, between the ruler and those closest to him. It was, in the language of the empire, a legal occasion, a day when a request once received became a debt. Amestris had not planned an act of revenge. She had planned a legal transaction, to be conducted on the one day of the year when the transaction could not be refused. On the royal birthday, surrounded by the full court, bound by tradition that underwrote the ceremonial authority of the monarchy itself, Amestris made her request. She wanted Masistes' wife, not a Ratinga, not the young woman who had worn the robe, not the one who had slept with her husband, the mother, the woman Xerxes had originally desired, who had refused him, who had never done anything in this entire spiral of obsession and betrayal except be wanted by the wrong man and refuse him when he came for her. Herodotus is unusually specific about Xerxes' reaction. He was profoundly uncomfortable with the request. He understood immediately what Amestris intended to do, and he understood equally that Masistes' wife was innocent, specifically innocent of the thing Amestris was punishing her for. He tried to redirect. He offered gifts, cities, wealth, anything Amestris wanted except what she was asking for. He bargained, he stalled, he tried everything available to him. But it was the royal birthday. The vow had been made. The court was present. To refuse was not merely to disappoint his wife, it was to break the ceremonial framework through which his own authority derived its legitimacy. The King of Kings could not be seen to violate the law of the royal birthday. Not in front of everyone. Not without undermining the very institutional structure that made him king. He handed her over. What followed was not a crime of passion. It was the fulfillment of a legal obligation. Amestris had Masistes' wife brought to her. And then, in a chamber somewhere inside the most gilded palace complex the ancient world had built, with servants present and lamps burning and the smell of incense still in the air, within the formal structure of a royal birthday gift duly requested and duly granted, she ordered the mutilation, her breasts cut off, thrown to the dogs, her nose removed, her ears, her lips, her tongue. The woman who had refused a king and committed no other crime was methodically, precisely, deliberately unmade, not killed. Killing would have been mercy, and mercy was not the point. The point was the sending back. The point was that this had happened legally, within procedure, with the king's own formal consent, granted under obligation, recorded in the calendar as a birthday gift. Take a breath here, because this is where the story crosses the boundary between ancient history and something that reaches through 25 centuries and refuses to stay at a comfortable distance. This was not the heat of war, not the chaos of conquest. This was cold, deliberate, ceremonially authorized, carried out in a palace with every luxury of civilization surrounding it, and with the full weight of royal law behind it. The contrast is not incidental, it is the point. Amestris had not committed an act of savagery, she had committed an act of governance, and that is far more terrifying. Masistes, confronted with what had been returned to him, began planning to flee to Bactria, the eastern province he governed, where he had the relationships and the resources to raise a rebellion against his brother, against Xerxes, against the King of Kings himself. He never made it. Xerxes' agents intercepted him and his sons on the road. They were killed, every one of them. And here is the thing the clean military language conceals. Masistes did not die because Xerxes defeated him. Masistes died because Xerxes could not say no. Trace the line of causality, and it leads back every time to a single moment on a single birthday in a lamplit throne room. Xerxes could not refuse Amestris' request because he had made a ceremonial vow he lacked the will or the institutional authority to break. He could not refuse the vow because he had allowed the birthday ritual to become the architecture of the court's reciprocal obligations. He had allowed it because a king who believes he is divine rarely thinks carefully about the structural mechanisms he is submitting himself to. He had not thought carefully because his entire upbringing had told him that he was the system, that the system served him, that the King of Kings was not subject to the same logic that governed lesser men. And so the dynasty killed itself. Step by step, choice by choice, one man's inability to recognize the limits of his own power, cascading outward until it consumed his own blood. Masistes did not die at the hands of an enemy. He died because his brother could not look at his queen on a birthday morning and say, "No, not this, not her." Xerxes had just killed his own brother, because his own desire had created a chain of events so tangled that the only available resolution was bloodshed within the royal household itself. This is what Amestris understood that Xerxes did not. She had not simply punished one woman. She had sent a message to everyone watching, every noble, every satrap, every dignitary with eyes on the Persian court. The message: the queen sees everything, the queen forgets nothing, and the queen is patient enough to wait for the day the law is on her side. But there was another message, one Amestris did not intend and the empire could not afford to acknowledge. By forcing Xerxes to hand over an innocent woman, by engineering the death of his own brother through the mechanism of a ceremonial obligation, Amestris had demonstrated something empires prefer to conceal, that the King of Kings could be maneuvered, that the system built to give Xerxes absolute control over women was also, from a different angle, a system through which the most politically sophisticated woman in the court could exercise extraordinary influence over the king. The harem was designed to make women controllable. What no one had fully calculated was what happened when the woman doing the controlling was not inside the harem, but beside the king. Amestris outlived Xerxes. When he was assassinated in 465 BC, stabbed in his bedchamber by Artabanus, the commander of the royal guard, the man whose entire function was to keep the king alive, Amestris became the power behind the throne of her son Artaxerxes I. Ancient sources, including Ctesias of Cnidus, describe her later years as characterized by the same ruthlessness that had defined her earlier ones. She buried 14 Persian noblemen, alive as an offering to the gods of the underworld, an act so extreme it hovers at the boundary between history and myth, except that multiple ancient sources record it independently. She was not a monster in any simple sense. She was a woman who had spent her entire life inside a system engineered to make her powerless, and she had found every crack in that system, every lever, every pressure point, every ceremonial occasion that could be turned into a transaction. The cruelty was real and undeniable, but so was the trap that produced it. A queen in the Persian court had no army, no legal standing, no public platform, no avenue of recourse, only the instruments the palace gave her and the intelligence to know when and how to use them. The system did not produce monsters, it produced people who survived the system by becoming what the system rewarded, and what the Persian court rewarded, above all, was the capacity to wait, to watch and to strike with absolute precision when the moment arrived. Pull back from the palace now. Pull back from the lamplit corridors and the gilded chambers and the intimate catastrophes of Xerxes' court. Pull back until the palace is a small bright point in a vast darkness, and the darkness resolves into geography, the extraordinary, almost incomprehensible geography of the Achaemenid Empire at the height of its power, from Macedonia in the northwest to the Indus Valley in the east, from the Black Sea in the north to the Nile's first cataract in the south. If you rode from one border to the other at the fastest pace a horse could sustain, the journey would take months. The world would change around you, language, climate, culture, religion, architecture, and you would still be inside Persia. Across this territory, in conquered capitals from Babylon to Sardis to Memphis to Susa, the same pattern repeated, sometimes with the operatic drama of the Masistes affair, more often quietly, efficiently, so smoothly that history barely noticed. The pattern was this: a kingdom falls, a king is captured or killed, his family, his wives, his daughters, his sisters, the women who represented the living continuity of his dynasty, is absorbed into the Persian court system, catalogued, processed, controlled, and through that control, through the simple biological fact of proximity to Persian power over time, the next generation begins to carry Persian blood, speak the Persian language, dream in the Persian cosmology. This was not accident, it was the most sophisticated form of conquest the ancient world had devised. Consider Babylon. When Cyrus the Great marched his army into the greatest city on earth in 539 BC, he did something that shocked the ancient world. He did not sack it. He did not burn its temples or massacre its population. He presented himself as a liberator, issued the remarkable Cyrus Cylinder Declaration, restoring deported peoples and honoring local gods, and was recorded by some Babylonian sources as almost a savior figure. For centuries, scholars have called the Cyrus Cylinder one of the earliest human rights documents in the historical record. But look at what happened beneath that merciful surface. Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, a complex, deeply strange figure who had spent much of his reign in the Arabian oasis of Timur, rather than ruling his kingdom, leaving his son Belshazzar as regent, was captured. His precise fate remains historically uncertain. Sources conflict, and the record is incomplete. What is clearer is the fate of Babylon's royal women, the daughters and wives of the last dynasty. They entered the Persian processing system. Their identities, their dynastic continuity, their futures, all of it passed under Achaemenid control. Babylon's royal line, 3,000 years of Mesopotamian kingship, simply ended, not with fire and screaming, with administration, with cataloguing, with the quiet mechanisms of absorption. And with that ending, something that had existed for 3 millennia vanished from the world, not the city. Babylon continued, its buildings standing, its people going about their lives, but the dynasty, the bloodline that connected the city's rulers to its founding mythology, to its gods, to its history, that was gone, absorbed into Persia, diluted by Persian blood, replaced within a generation by administrators who answered to Persepolis. This is what made Persian imperial strategy more sophisticated, and in some ways more permanently destructive than Roman conquest. Rome destroyed things: temples, cities, populations. Rome's violence was legible, visible, leaving behind ruins that testified to what had been. Persia absorbed. And absorption, done correctly, leaves the conquered people nothing to hold on to. No dynasty to rally around. No queen to symbolize resistance. No bloodline through which a future liberator could claim legitimate right to rule. Just Persian administration, Persian blood in the ruling families, Persian religious tolerance that was really a form of religious neutralization. The Romans turned people into property, the Persians turned dynasties into records, and then they turned the records into silence. When the Persians needed to make a more explicit point, when a province rebelled, when a subject king overestimated his independence, when a border general's ambitions exceeded his loyalty, they could produce a different kind of message, the kind carved into mountainsides. The Bistun inscription stands on a cliff face in what is now the Kermanshah province of northwestern Iran, carved approximately 1,200 feet above the road below, in a location so sheer and so high that in the ancient world you could not read it. You could see that it was there. You could see the massive carved panel of figures, 9 rebel kings, roped and bound in a line, one of them lying beneath the boot of the dominant figure, all of them dwarfed by the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda, blessing the scene from above. You could see, off to one side, a figure impaled on a stake. You did not need to read the text to understand the message. Darius the Great commissioned the inscription to record his rise to power and his suppression of the rebellions that erupted across the empire when he seized the throne after the death of Cambyses. It is written in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, because Darius wanted every literate person in the empire to be able to read his version of events. The impaled figure is Fragments, a Median rebel who had claimed descent from the ancient Median royal line and attempted to restore it. The inscription records his fate in clinical detail. What the inscription does not record, what no monument ever adequately captured, is what happened to Fragments' family, to the families of the 9 bound kings, to the wives and daughters of the men whose rebellion Darius had crushed, and whose images he had carved into stone as eternal advertisement of their defeat. They entered the processing system, the harem, or arranged marriages with Persian officials, or both. Their children grew up speaking Persian. Their grandchildren did not remember their grandfather's name except as a cautionary story. The bloodlines that had threatened Darius's authority were not merely defeated, they were biologically redirected, their genetic legacy folded into the empire that had crushed them, their descendants eventually indistinguishable from the population they had once hoped to lead in rebellion. This is what historians call the puppet king strategy, and it may be the most coldly elegant piece of imperial engineering the ancient world produced. By absorbing the women of conquered royal families through the harem, through arranged marriages, through the systematic proximity of captive bloodlines to Persian power, Persia could engineer, within a single generation, a claimant to any provincial throne who was simultaneously native enough to be accepted by the local population and Persian enough to be trusted by the court. Your rebellion ends with you. Your daughter's son becomes the next governor. He performs the local religious rites and speaks the local language at public ceremonies. But, in private, he thinks in Persian. He dreams in Persian. He sends his reports to Persepolis in Persian. The dynasty your family built is not destroyed. It is more thoroughly erased than destruction could manage. It is replaced from the inside with something that looks like continuity but serves the empire. Against this backdrop of empire-wide systematic erasure, the story of Amestris and Masistes' wife takes on a different dimension. What happened in that palace chamber was not aberrant. It was the system operating at its most intimate, most personal scale, the same mechanisms of control and erasure that played out across 30 nations, now playing out within the royal family itself. The empire had turned its own tools on its own people, and this is where we can see the fracture lines that would eventually bring the empire down. Xerxes never fully recovered the internal authority he lost in the Masistes affair. The execution of his own brother sent ripples through the court's network of loyalties that could not be repaired by proclamation or ceremony. The eastern provinces which Masistes had governed and where he had been respected became more restive. Trust within the royal family cracked further, and Xerxes himself spent the last years of his reign increasingly turned inward, absorbed in the intrigues of his own court, looking without quite knowing it for the knife that was already being sharpened. It came in 465 BC. Artabanus, the commander of the royal guard, the man whose entire function was to protect the king's life, stabbed Xerxes in his bedchamber. The king of kings, the divine representative of Ahura Mazda, the man who had whipped the sea and carved his victories into mountains, died in the dark, alone, in the room he should have been safest in. Amestris survived him. She became the power behind the throne of Artaxerxes I, exercising the same patient, watchful, strategic authority she had always possessed, now from a position that did not even require the mechanism of a birthday vow. Ancient sources describe her final recorded act of cruelty, the burial of 14 Persian noblemen alive, in terms that suggest she had not become softer with age. She had simply become more powerful. There is a comparison that history keeps pushing us toward, and it is worth making explicit. Rome and Persia. Two empires, two systems, two fundamentally different approaches to the problem of how you make people obey. Rome was loud. Rome's violence was theatrical, public, almost honest. The arena, the cross, the slave market, these were open declarations of power, visible to everyone, comprehensible in their brutality. When Rome wanted to demonstrate what happened to rebels, it crucified them along the road into the city, so you could not miss them on your way in. The message was delivered in broad daylight. Persia was quiet. Persia's violence happened in palace chambers and administrative records. The harem's walls were real, but you could not see inside them. The mutilations were performed in private. The absorbed dynasties disappeared so gradually that there was no single clear moment when the native bloodline ended and the Persian one began. The fear was architectural, built into the structure of daily life, into the protocol of the court, into the very calendar with its royal birthday and its ceremonial obligations. You could not point to the exact mechanism of your own subjugation. It was everywhere, which meant it was invisible. Rome built chains you could see and break. Persia built a world in which the concept of breaking free had been so thoroughly incorporated into the existing structure that it was no longer clearly distinguishable from compliance. The people who suffered most from the Persian system were not the soldiers on battlefields, they were the women in palaces, the queens absorbed, the daughters traded, the wives mutilated and sent home as legal transactions completed on royal birthdays. The women who entered the harem young and full of futures and became, over the decades, entries in an administrative record that no one alive today has read. Their names were documented somewhere, in languages that took centuries to decipher, in registers that survived if they survived at all, through the accidents of climate and archaeology, and the decisions of conquerors about which buildings to burn. Most of those names are gone. The women who bore them are gone. Their stories exist, if they exist at all, only in the gaps between the recorded events, in the spaces where the history says, and his family was absorbed, and then moves on to the next battle, the next satrap, the next year's tribute. We know Amestris's name because she survived long enough and wielded enough power that the ancient sources could not ignore her. We know Artainta's name because her affair with Xerxes was too dramatic for Herodotus to omit. We know Esther's name because her story was preserved in scripture by a community that needed it. But Masistes' wife, the woman at the absolute center of the most viscerally horrifying episode in all of Herodotus's account of the Persian court, her name is gone. And this is not accidental. The empire intended it. The empire was in fact extraordinarily good at erasing names. The harem registers catalogued women precisely so that their individual identities could be subsumed into administrative categories. The inscriptions at Behistun recorded the defeat of rebel kings in 3 languages so that the king's narrative would survive. Everything the Persian imperial machine produced was designed to ensure that the story the empire wanted told would be the story that lasted. The story of what happened to Masistes' wife was not the story the empire wanted told. It was a story about a king's weakness, about a queen's manipulation of ceremonial law, about the suicide of a dynasty caused by one man's inability to say no. It was a story about the processing machine turning on the people who built it. This was precisely the kind of story the empire's apparatus of silence, the harem walls, the administrative records, the propaganda inscriptions, existed to prevent from surviving, and yet here she is, still in the story, still making us stop, 25 centuries after she walked back through that corridor. and not because Herodotus was simply doing his job. Because what Herodotus did, what every person who has written this story down in the millennia since has done, is an act of direct defiance against the empire's original intent. Every time this story is told, the machine fails. Every time her suffering is named, the silence the empire engineered is broken. The harem walls are down, the registers are dust. The empire that spent such extraordinary energy ensuring that certain stories would not survive has been gone for 2,000 years, and the story it most wanted silenced is still speaking. That is not poetic coincidence. That is the specific particular defeat of a specific particular imperial strategy. Persia built its power on the premise that it controlled the record, that what it chose to document would survive and what it chose to erase would disappear. For most of its subjects most of the time, that premise held. The harem consumed women and their names with bureaucratic efficiency. The inscriptions preserved the king's version of events in stone. The processing machine processed. But it missed Herodotus. It missed the human instinct, older than any empire, to say, "I saw this, I will not let this disappear." And in missing that, it ensured that the story of its own cruelty, the story of a legal transaction performed on a birthday, of a dynasty killing itself through one man's weakness, of a nameless woman sent back to her husband in pieces, would outlast every road it built, and every palace it raised, and every inscription it carved into mountainsides to announce its permanence. Persia's roads are dust, its palaces are magnificent ruins. The Behistun inscription is still up on that cliff face, still showing Darius with his boot on a rebel's chest, the text waiting in 3 dead languages for someone with the knowledge to read it. But the story of a nameless woman mutilated in a gilded palace, that story you understood the moment you heard it. No translation required, no specialized knowledge, because it is not about Persia, it is not about the 5th century BC. It is about what power does when it believes it controls the record entirely. It is about the one thing the processing machine cannot process, the stubborn, unkillable human refusal to let the silence win. The Empire of Shadows built its power on erasure, on making people vanish so completely that no one would remember to miss them. It did not succeed. She is still here. The story survived. And that, in the specific, deliberate, defiant sense of that word, is everything.